Okay, hello mga students. I-apply na natin ngayon yung internal control sa audit. So, 'di ba, as part of our understanding the entity and its environment, nakalagay doon including the internal control. So, let's consider internal control sa ating mga audit because it will also determine the extent, okay, of our audit procedures, yung ating mga substantive testings. Now, in considering the internal control sa audit, tandaan po ninyo, the same sa prevention and detection ng fraud, errors, and even non-compliance. Si auditor po ay hindi responsable sa pag-establish at pag-maintain ng internal control. Ito po ay responsibility management. Okay? Yung naka-underline dito. Although, of course, si auditor, he or she should give adequate consideration. Dapat i-consider niya itong mga presence ng mga internal controls because, sabi nga dito, the quality of the entity's internal control systems can have a significant impact on the audit. Especially na when we are determining the audit risk, isa yung control risk sa factor doon sa ating audit risk model. So, assessing the control at high or at less than high will impact our substantive testing. So, dito po makikita po ninyo sa slide na ito, meron tayong 5 hakbang, no? In considering the entity's internal control. Una, obtain understanding of the internal control. Iintindihin po natin, Pangalawa, we will have to document that understanding. Understanding is different from documenting because documenting is basically your narrative or yun nga, documentation. Ano bang ibang synonym ng documentation? Ito na yung isusulat natin kung ano yung pagkakaintindi natin doon sa internal control based on the procedures that we will be doing. And then, understanding, eto na yung we will have to assess the level of control risk. Ano na naman itong document the understanding of a accounting, of an accounting, dapat yan, Okay. Sorry, OC. Number 4, after assessing the level of control risk, we will perform test of controls. But later on, malaman natin if the test of control is a mandatory step or pwede itong ma-skip. Okay? Number 5, document the assessed level of control risks. So kung mapapansin po ninyo, umiikot lang yung consideration of internal control sa dalawa. Understanding and then testing. Kasi sa understanding, kadikit na po dyan yung documentation. Sa testing, kadikit na rin po dyan yung documentation. Okay? So yan po yung pag-uusapan natin one by one sa video lecture na ito. Let's talk first about understanding the internal control. Obtaining an understanding of the entity's internal control. So it is the role, it is the job of the auditor to obtain sufficient, nakalagay dito, sapat na understanding of the components of the entity's internal control. Components, ito yung kakadiscuss lang natin in the previous video lecture, yung ating crime. Now, obtaining an understanding of internal control will involve the following. Una, we will be evaluating the design of a control. Design, hinighlight natin ito, At pangalawa, determining whether it has been implemented. Evaluation of the design is different from determination whether or not it is implemented. Because design is, of course, placing the, sandali medyo, hindi ko alam kung naririnig ninyo yung ingay sa background ko, tumatahol yung mga aso. But I hope sana hindi masyado ganun kalakas. Medyo malakas lang kasi from my end. Please take note, magkaiba yung design sa implementation because pag dinidesign natin, okay, we are conceptualizing ano ba yung mga controls, We are designing the control system. Pag implementation, ito na yung ini-enforce na natin ito. So, two things ang understanding natin. Evaluate the design Okay ba yung design nito? Of course, on the part of the auditor, we are evaluating the design. We are not designing, ha? Ano lang, pasintabi lang, baka yung pagkaintindi natin ng una is we will design control bilang mga auditors. Hindi po. We will evaluate. I-assess natin yung design ng control. And then, ayan, we will determine implemented ba yung mga controls na yan. So that is how we do an understanding, how we obtain an understanding. Now, evaluating the design of a control involves, yung una, evaluating the design of a control involves considering whether yung control individually or in combination with other controls is capable of effectively preventing or detecting and correcting material misstatements. O kaya nga maganda na mabalikan po ninyo yung isa kong video lecture na inassign ko sa inyo kasi kasama na po dun yung PDC model, Preventive, Detective, Corrective Controls. Because we are talking about different controls here. Ano yung preventive control? Ano yung detective control? Ano yung corrective control? Can you please share how do you understand them? It's either after watching the video lecture, after studying it, or initially before you read something, before you study something. Pag just basing it on the terminologies, ano yung differences kaya nitong preventive, detective, corrective? Okay? Implementation of a control means that the control exists and the controls have been placed in operations. Okay? So, magkaiba yan ha. Pag ini-evaluate natin yung design ng control, we are assessing whether the controls individually or in combination with other controls is capable of effectively preventing, detecting, and correcting material misstatements. Samantalang yung implementation and determining whether it has been implemented, ibig nito sabihin, existing na yung control. Pero, gumagana nga ba? Okay? Is it in place in operations? Now, an initial understanding of the design muna tayo, of the entity's internal control system is ordinarily obtained sa pamamagitan ng mga sumusunod. Inquiry, inspection, observation. Pag inquiry, nagtatanong-tanong tayo, Okay, mamaya na yon. Pag inspection, meron tayong chine-check ng mga documents and controls or na records, Pag observation, nag-observe ba tayo, Nakikiramdam tayo. Okay? Pinapakiramdaman natin yung mga activities, yung operations. Pagkatapos natin makakuha ng sapat na kaalaman about the design of the system, the auditor should determine whether itong mga controls na ito ay implemented. So initially, evaluate the design and then determine whether or not it is implemented. So two parts yan na understanding natin. Sa papaanong pamamaraan natin ito ginagawa, nagwo-walk through tayo. So, etong word na walkthrough ay hindi po ito bagong terminology pagdating sa mga auditors. Pero sa inyong mga students, maaring bago lang po. First time nilang ito marinig. Pag walkthrough, parang minsan kasi pagkausap natin yung kliyente, can you please walk me through the process? Ibig sabihin, pag nag-walkthrough testing tayo, from start to end, ina-understand po natin yon. So, how do we do that? Ano yung mga ginagawa dito? Sabi dito, etong task ng walkthrough involves tracing one or two transactions through the entire accounting system from the initial recording at source to their final destination. Kaya nga sinabi ko, from start to finish. Okay? Walkthrough also confirms the auditor's understanding of how the accounting system and control procedures function. Kasi syempre, di ba, as part of our understanding, nagkakaroon tayo ng idea kung paano ito gumagana, paano ito umiikot, paano siya gumagalaw. So, pag nag-walkthrough tayo, nakukonfirm natin na tama ba yung aking understanding. Or baka mamaya may kulang sa aking pagkakaintindi. So, that is why we perform walkthrough. Now, sabi dito, it is to be emphasized na hindi po required, okay, si auditor na mag-obtain ng knowledge, ng kaalaman about the operating effectiveness of the internal control. Okay? Please take note ha. It is not required to obtain knowledge about the operating effectiveness. At this stage, no, yung objective ni auditor is to understand the design of the controls and whether it is being implemented. Yun pa lamang po at this point of our understanding the internal control, ang objective pa lang natin dito is to evaluate the design and to determine whether it is implemented. And it is not a requirement that we should already obtain knowledge whether or not the controls are operating effectively. Okay? Magkakaiba po yan ha. At this point, yung step 1, understanding the entity's internal control. Ano yung trabaho ni auditor? Evaluate yung design, determine whether it is implemented. Required ba na i-test yung or magkaroon ng kaalaman sa operating effectiveness nito? Not yet. Hindi pa. Not required. Maaari pero hindi required. Now, the auditor uses the understanding of internal control to first, identify types of potential misstatements that may occur. Pangalawa, consider factors that affect the risk of material misstatements. At pangatlo, to design the NTE, nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures na ipe-perform natin. So, ganyan po natin mapapakinabangan yung pag-understand ng internal controls. Pangalawa, document na natin ito. Yung understanding natin ng internal control. Sa paanong pamamaraan itong documentation. Sabi dito, at ito yung aking in-underline, yung documentation need not be in any particular form. Wala itong specific instruction na dapat ganito yung susundan natin. Yung extent ng documentation may vary. It will depend based on the size, yung laki ng company na ina-understand mo, yung complexity ng operations nito, ng mga systems nito, the nature, of course, yung nature of the entity's internal control system. Some commonly used forms of documentation includes the following. Narrative, ninanarrate natin, sinusulat natin. Flowchart. Okay, pag flowchart, may mga diagrams tayo na ginagamit. Sa Accounting Information System ko na playlist, meron akong discussion doon on flowcharting, how to create flowcharts, in assisting the auditors or even the other users in preparing in documentation. Kasi usually yung mga processes ng isang company, dino-document yan through a combination of narrative and mga flowcharts. Kasi yung flowchart is a graphical illustration. Papaano ginagawa? Ano yung proseso step by step? Pag narrative kasi minsan ang nakakatamad basahin, lalong-lalo na kung mahahaba. As compared kung meron tayong start to end, ito yung process, by graphical representation. So we have a more manageable means of understanding the process. Or kaya naman, internal control questionnaires na pinapasagutan natin sa management para malaman natin yung responses nila on their understanding of the internal control. Okay, mga internal control questionnaires. Or a combination of this one. All right? After we document, we assess the control risk. Please take note na at this point, yung assessment ng control risk is preliminary. Initial pa lamang po. Okay? Basahin ko muna ha. After daw makapag-obtain tayo at makapag-document ng understanding ng accounting and internal control system, si auditor should make a preliminary assessment of control risk at the assertion level for each material account balances or class of transactions. Sabi dito, yung preliminary assessment daw ng control risk may be at high level, which is 100%, or less than high level. At high or at less than high. Now, when the auditor's knowledge of the entity's internal control indicates that the internal controls related to our particular assertion are not effective, the auditor may simply assess control risk at a high level. Pag ganito yan, ito na yung sinasabi ko kanina, yung tanong ko. Mamaya, malalaman natin kung optional ba or required ba. Hindi ko na maalala yung eksakto na nasabi ko kanina. Yung step 4, which is the test of controls. Because according here, kung hindi effective yung internal control, we can simply assess the control risk to be high at hindi na po tayo magte-test ng controls. Okay? So, no test of controls need to be performed. And the auditor will rely solely or primarily sa substantive testings. Okay, so yun po Therefore, sa step 4, yung TOC, depende doon sa assessment natin ng control risk. Kung less than high siya, pwede po tayo mag-test ng controls. Pero pag at high na siya, di-disregard na natin yung test of controls. Substantive procedures na tayo. On the other hand, yung kabaligtaran naman, if the auditor believes that the controls appear to be reliable, please take note preliminary assessment. Kaya nga sabi dito, the auditor believes that controls appears to be reliable. Mukhang reliable. We will determine whether it is really reliable or not by performing test of controls. Determine whether it is efficient to obtain the evidence to justify an assessment of control at a lower level. Auditor concludes that it is more efficient to rely on the internal control system. So, ang plano natin sa control risk ay less than high level. For that purpose, we will identify specific internal control policies or procedures that are likely to prevent or detect and correct material misstatements relevant to FS assertions and perform TOs, yung test of controls, to determine the effectiveness of such policies. If we set the control risk at less than high level, we have to identify specific internal control policies, procedures, okay? Para ma-PDC, prevent, detect, correct material misstatements, And then, perform TOC para malaman natin effective na ba yan. So that is the time after testing the controls can we determine the operating effectiveness of those controls. Okay? Number 4, kung sinabi natin na yung control risk ay less than high level, okay, we will perform test of controls. Please take note irrespective of how internal may appear to be in preventing material misstatements from occurring, basahin ko muna tuloy, Parang ang haba ng walang pospos. Irrespective of how effective internal control procedures may appear to be, Regardless kung mukhang effective or hindi. Parang ganun yung sinasabi niya kasi irrespective of how effective, in preventing material misstatements from occurring in the FS, before the auditor can rely on them to reduce. Ang target kasi natin is to check whether or not, whether, of course, based on assessment, preliminary assessment, mukhang reliable yung test of yung controls. I-test natin. Kasi kung reliable yan, pwede nating pababaan yung substantive tests. Pero mukhang reliable. And then after our test of controls, nakita natin na hindi pala siya reliable. Dadagdagan natin, dadamihan natin yung ating substantive tests. Okay? Kaya nga, before the auditor can rely on them to reduce substantive tests. Kasi kung hindi natin yan maaasahan, madami yung ating substantive tests. The auditor must test these controls to obtain evidence that they are working effectively as the preliminary assessment suggests. So papatutuhanan or papasinungalingan natin yung initial na assessment natin na mukhang reliable si control. Pag mukhang reliable, okay, pag na-test na natin, after TOC, nasabi natin substantive testing. Pag hindi, increase, Paano natin ginagawa yung test of controls? Okay? Test of controls are performed to obtain evidence about the effectiveness of the design and of the operations. Design of the accounting and internal control, effective ba yan? Effective din ba yung operations? Operating effectively. Kasi Minsan, pag nagtitest tayo ng controls, we identify that there are deficiency in the design, ano? Not only may mga control weaknesses, ano? Hindi lamang po the controls are not operating effectively. Minsan, maaring may ma-encounter tayo that the controls are not designed para maka-capture, ano, ng mga material misstatements for FS purposes, no? For audit purposes. So, we will also assess the effectiveness of the design. Okay? So, dalawa ang natatamaan ng test of controls, design and operating effectiveness. Okay? It is important to note that the auditor will only test the operating effectiveness of controls that are likely to detect or prevent material misstatements. Okay? Hindi lahat ha. Only those controls na makakapag likely to detect or prevent material misstatements. So, yung pinaplano, yung tingin natin makakapag-rely tayo. So, yun po ang ite-test lamang sa ating TOC. Hindi lahat. Selective pa rin po tayo dito. The auditor should obtain audit evidence through TOC. Pag sinabi kong TOC, test of controls, to support test control risk at less than high level. Binababaan natin yung ating control risk. Di patunayan natin na maaasahan natin yung controls, no? That they are in place. They are operating effectively. The design is effective also. The lower the assessment of control risk, the more support the auditor should obtain that the internal control is designed and operating effectively. Okay, therefore, itong naka-highlight the greater the reliance the auditor plans to place on internal control, the more extensive the test of those controls that need to be performed. Please take note ha, baka kasi later on malito-lito kayo dyan. That is step 4. Step 5, documenting naman. So, documenting the assessed level of control risk. After natin ma-evaluate yung results ng TO control risk, the auditor should document yung assessment ng control risk. If the control risk is assessed at a high level, the auditor should document his conclusion. Bakit mo nasabi? Paano mo nasabi? Of course, dapat supported. Bakit high? Bakit less than high? Parehas din ha. The auditor should document his conclusion if the assessment is at less than high level. And for that assessment, the basis is actually the results of your TOC. Hence, the auditor cannot assess control risk at less than high level without performing TOC. So para ma-assess natin yung controls at less than high, we have to perform TOC or the test of controls. Okay? Communication of internal control weaknesses, because as a result of our consideration of our understanding ng internal control system, maaring maging aware si auditor na may mga weaknesses sa systems. Okay? In this regard, the auditor is required to report to the appropriate level of management material weaknesses in the design or operation. Eto pag sinabi nating control weaknesses, maaring sa design or sa operation, not necessarily design lamang. Okay? So sabi dito, which have come to the auditor's attention during your understanding, during your test of controls. This communication would ordinarily be in writing and should be done at the earliest opportunity so that appropriate corrective actions may be taken as soon as possible. At the earliest possible time, oral communication could also be made that these are adequately documented in the audit working paper. So it has to be properly documented para meron tayong support. Okay? Emphasis si auditor, hindi po siya required na maghanap ng control weaknesses. Baka sabihin ninyo, part yan, required si auditor na maghanap, mag-search, mag-identify ng internal control weaknesses. Hindi po. Kung meron lang siyang nakita during sa kanyang understanding ng internal control at saka sa mga testing ng controls, no? The auditors, however, must communicate internal control weaknesses to the client when they come to their attention during the course of the audit na mayroong control weaknesses. And this is usually documented formally sa pamamagitan ng management letter. Okay? So, hanggang dyan muna, class, ano? Yung in the consideration of internal control, meron pa po tayong karugtong dito discussing test of controls on a separate video lecture. Now, if you have any questions on our discussion for this lecture, please let me know para ma-assist ko kayo. Ano? Maraming salamat and I'll see you again on the next lecture. Bye-bye!